Welcome to this episode of the Civil War Digital Digest. I'm your host, Jeremy, and I'm here with Dan Wambaugh today. And for around 20 years, he's been researching the sharpshooters in the American Civil War, and he's going to share some of their stories with us through their weapons. Dan, before we get to the weapons, I know you want to talk a little bit about the different terminology that's used with this type of troop.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the interesting things is it can be quite confusing because you read these accounts, these original accounts, and they'll all talk about sharpshooters. And the trouble is that can mean a lot of different things. Basically, it runs the gamut from what we know of as light infantry from, say, the Napoleonic time to a modern sniper using a weapon that can kill someone at a mile. And all of these guys are called sharpshooters. Occasionally, in, say, the accounts of the death of General Reynolds, you see just regular Confederate skirmishers being referred to as sharpshooters. And generally speaking, there's no rule for when an original soldier in one of his accounts mentions a sharpshooter. A lot of times it can just refer to someone taking an individual shot rather than firing volleys.
So Dan, let's pick up the story then with the weapons. That's a big part of why we're here today. And I see some similarities. I know there's some US and CS weapons in here. Maybe we'll start off at the top, and the one that has a feature that makes it different than the rest of these as well.
Sure, and honestly, with the top one is one of my absolute favorites. This is a Berdan Contract Model 1859 Sharps rifle. When the U.S. sharpshooters, both the 1st and 2nd U.S., were formed, Berdan wanted them to have special rifles. Primarily what makes a Berdan Contract different is it does have this double set trigger here. You don't have to use the second trigger, but when you do engage it, it makes the front trigger a hair trigger. But the salient feature of a Sharps rifle is that it is a breech loader. Just like the carbines, you can drop the block, you insert the cartridge in it, and then simply close the block, cap the rifle, and you're ready to fire. At times, you can engage the Lawrence pellet primer system in the rifle, so you don't even have to cap it. There are accounts of Federal soldiers when they get into hot combat at close range, such as the Wilderness, they just use the Lawrence primer, and it cuts the loading time by a significant amount. These are very handy in the bush, especially being able to load and fire a rifle without having to load it from the muzzle. You can stay under a concealed position. The next in line that we have, this is a pattern 1856 infield rifle. This is a British-made gun. This was the most common rifle, two-band rifle imported by the Confederacy during the war. These aren't really ballistically superior to the three-band infield. Some of the other short rifles are. They have heavier barrels and more bells and whistles to them, but the pattern of 1856 was very much loved by the Confederate sharpshooter battalions because it's, again, short, it's handy, you can use it to go through the brush, through the woods, and it's a very nice rifle for that purpose. So is the Fayetteville rifle. This is our next one. This is a Confederate copy of the Model 1855 U.S. rifle that was produced at Harper's Ferry. These were actually produced on the same machinery as the ones that were produced at Harper's Ferry, but it was kind of a Confederatized version of it with some features changed. You see the brass fittings and things like that, some corners that they cut. This is a good example of a civilian hunting rifle used in the up through the 1840s, 1850s. This is of the type that was carried by Burgess Western sharpshooters. These were men from Illinois, from Michigan, and all over the upper Midwest. Originally designated the 14th Missouri, later the 66th Illinois. They carried these weapons early in the war and didn't find them to be the most practical weapon to use in the field. They had to mold their own bullets for them. They're slow to fire. They're very accurate, but in terms of a combat situation, they weren't ideal. And so you actually see Burgess sharpshooters being one of the first units to begin making private purchases of Henry rifles. And so by the time of the Atlanta campaign, almost the entire regiment is equipped with Henry rifles, making them an incredibly fearsome light infantry unit to come up against. From here, we kind of depart from our light infantry rifles, our skirmishers, to what we would nowadays term a sniper. But again, these are also soldiers called sharpshooters during the time. Here on the top, this is a Whitworth rifle. It's a British-made rifle made by the Whitworth Rifle Company. The salient feature of this, what made it so special, is it doesn't have a round bore. It has a hexagonal bore, where the bullet, which was about this long, mechanically fit into the bore and would generally have a significant powder charge behind it. It made this an incredibly good long-range rifle. That long bullet is much more ballistically perfect than a mini ball, though the Whitworths are an incredibly expensive weapon. Confederate purchasing agents that went over to Britain found that the base model Whitworth cost $1,000 in gold. That's gold, not Confederate script, gold. And that's the base model, no scope, no case, anything like that. So as you go up, it's more expensive. But that $1,000 adjusted for inflation is about $27,000. And for obvious reasons, the Confederacy did not import a great many of these Whitworths. A close cousin to the Whitworth is a Kerr rifle. Similarly, it was produced by a private manufacturing firm in Britain. The Kerr had an oblong bore to it, very unique, similar to the Whitworth, but a little bit larger. The Whitworth's a .451 caliber, whereas the Kerr's a little bit larger, but a little bit closer to the Enfields. Now, these two rifles were used most famously in Claiborne's sharpshooter unit, which was only about a dozen, maybe 15 men attached to Claiborne's division of the Army of Tennessee, who during the Chattanooga campaign shut down the entire supply line for the Army of the Cumberland, shooting over the Tennessee River from Lookout Mountain. They shut down the wagon trains by firing at the first wagon clogging the road, and then taking their time and picking off wagoneers, horses, and so on. So if you can imagine 15 men armed with these two type of rifles shutting down an entire army, I mean, that shows you the significance of a good rifle with a man who knew how to use it.
Definitely an example of their effectiveness in a combat situation.
Yeah, and this is from a huge distance across the river, so it's amazing.
So Dan, this is one that I'm really interested to hear about. It stands out, it's different, it's also quite heavy. Tell us the story behind this one.
So anybody who's been to our website, the first picture that you see is a Confederate sharpshooter holding this rifle. You can tell that I'm a big sharpshooter guy, and I love this rifle very much. This is an original target rifle produced in the late 1850s. It weighs 38 pounds with the scope. It is not the sort of item that an infantryman would have carried, or even a sharpshooter would have carried with him on the march. It would have been carried in its case with its appendages. I mean, you'll notice there's no ramrod, there's no other equipment to it. Then that's because all of that would have been in a case in the regimental baggage. Units like the Berdan sharpshooters, the U.S. sharpshooters, would have had a couple of target rifles similar to this in the regimental store with the baggage in the train, in case they got into a static situation where they needed to take out a high-value target or possibly a troublesome Confederate sharpshooter. These were produced by private companies, mostly in New England. The big heavy bore allowed for a larger powder charge. Normally these had kind of a small caliber, usually about a 36 or a 45. This one is unique. It has a 50 caliber, so it is absolutely at the top end of the size of the bullet that it would have fired. Again, smaller bullets are more ballistically perfect. And it also does not have a double set trigger. It simply has a hair trigger built into it. Very, very light touch will set this rifle off. You can see the full-length scope, which is a 4-power scope. In the right hands of somebody who's capable, this rifle could potentially hit somebody at a mile.
Wow. What a neat rifle, Dan. Thank you for sharing that one with us. We've kind of gone through the technology side. I want to connect back with the human element of combat and how that affected it. And I think you have a story you want to share with us that kind of takes us back to the Whitworth rifle as well. Yeah,
I think that the best account from the war that's representative of who the sharpshooters were, their different roles, and the differences even in the type of weapons that they carried, is the death of General Sedgwick at Spotsylvania. Sedgwick commanded the 6th Corps. He was one of the higher-ranking officers to be killed during the war, and his death is very well documented. He and his staff had ridden out to kind of a salient position in the Federal line while the trenches were being set up, and they began taking fire from individual shots. And one of his staff members wrote down the account of what essentially became his last words. Sedgwick said, "What, men dodging this way and that for single bullets? What will you do when they open up fire along the whole line? Why are you dodging like this? They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." Moments later, a Whitworth bullet struck him just below his left eye and killed him instantly. So we have an excellent account from the opposite side of the field, the Confederate troops that were facing the Federals, and Major W.S. Dunlop, who commanded the South Carolina Battalion of Sharpshooters that were attached to McGowan's brigade, wrote about seeing these Federal officers with General Sedgwick ride up to the salient position and open fire on them, mostly with their short rifles. Dunlop writes, "We discovered a 4-gun battery with its infantry supports placed there for the defense of the salient, barely within reach of our long-range rifles. And to these, Ben Powell with his Whitworth and a few files on the right paid their respects. Presently an officer of rank with his staff approached the salient, and adjusting his field glasses began to take observations of the front. A few shots only had been fired at the group when the ringing peal of Powell's Whitworth was heard some distance to the right. The officer was seen to stagger and fall. Powell reported at once that he had killed a Federal general, but we knew not his name or rank until it came out a few days later in the Northern papers announcing that General Sedgwick had been killed by a Confederate sharpshooter." So here we see Confederate sharpshooters, an organized battalion armed with short rifles, taking shots at the extreme range that the rifles would allow, but one of them happened to be armed with a Whitworth. So the Federals almost ridiculed the fire from the short rifles, not understanding that this incredible piece of equipment was being used in that sector, and that's the difference that a Whitworth round made.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think it does a great job kind of telling that story of the sharpshooters and how they were able to stand out and make a difference, but also it encapsulates that piece that we always hear about of the technology and the tactics and the thinking weren't quite lining up, and we're kind of catching up with, the emerging technologies like a Whitworth. So.
Yeah, the idea that an individual soldier with a rifle mounted with optics could now kill a general at the better part of a mile, that changed war forever.
That's
and so
a game changer.
You see in World War I or things like that, you see the generals conducting the battle from well behind the lines from then on.
Well, thank you, Dan. I know it's a big topic, and you kind of boil it down for us into kind of this encapsulating history through the weapons. I really enjoyed the story that you shared. I think that kind of gives a quick view into that evolving technology that we always hear about in the Civil War, and the catching up of the tactics and the thinking of some of the leaders with that story with Sedgwick. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Civil War Digital Digest. I know I always learn something when I spend time with Dan. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit that like button and subscribe so you can get updates on further content.